Scientists just found out that the Earth's crust beneath the Marmara Sea is sending seismic signals that look exactly like the kind that show up before a major earthquake. An earthquake that can shake entire coastlines and send waves racing toward crowded cities. For years, scientists focused on visible ruptures on land because they could measure and map them easily. But now, they made a detailed map of a huge fault system under the seafloor. The Mediterranean already sits at a dangerous crossroads where massive tectonic plates meet. Those plates push, scrape, and stretch against each other, and that constant motion creates massive stress. The crust there grows thinner over time, and thinner crust means it can't absorb stress easily. Stress builds, pressure mounts, and the signals coming from below show that parts of this fault system have started to move in unusual ways. The new map shows that future large earthquakes may begin at the boundaries where weaker and stronger sections of the crust meet, or along edges of highly resistive zones. They even pinpointed one of the most likely locations, beneath the Marmara Sea. What makes this discovery so intense is the scale. The faults in the seabed form long corridors where energy can accumulate for decades or centuries. Scientists warn that this setup is the kind that can produce a super earthquake, a massive seismic event capable of shaking large coastal cities and possibly generating tsunamis. A tsunami forms when the seafloor shifts vertically and displaces huge amounts of water, so it looks really plausible in this setting. The water it sets free radiates outward in powerful waves that can cross entire seas. The Mediterranean holds dozens of densely populated shorelines, so it could affect millions of lives. Speaking of that, let's zoom in on Istanbul, Turkey's largest and most populous city. The massive fault line sitting right under it doesn't act the way scientists thought it did. For years, experts looked at the main Marmara Fault, a branch of the North Anatolian Fault running beneath the Sea of Marmara, and worried it might rip in one single monstrous rupture. That kind of break could unleash a megaquake in the high 7s or beyond. But when scientists ran detailed computer simulations covering more than 10,000 years of earthquake cycles, they saw something different. The fault doesn't behave like one giant zipper waiting to unzip all at once. It behaves more like a row of connected tiles that break in sections. And the reason comes down to what's happening miles below the seafloor. It's called rheology. Simply put, how materials deform under stress, how rocks bend, stretch, or snap when you squeeze them hard enough. Under the central Sea of Marmara, giant piles of compacted mud, sand, and debris sit on top of warmer crust. In those upper layers, the sediment usually deforms slowly and steadily, especially at shallow depths where pressure and heat interact in specific ways. Deeper down, higher temperatures weaken the rocks. Warm rock flows more easily than cold rock. That heat acts like a built-in brake system that limits how far a rupture can tear through the crust. When researchers built a 3D earthquake cycle model, they fed in real heat flow measurements, rock friction data, and structural details, and replayed thousands of years of seismic activity. When they included both sediment thickness and temperature differences, the model finally matched history, including the powerful quakes of 1766 and 1912. And none of the simulated events exceeded magnitude 7.3. That level of shaking can collapse buildings, fracture infrastructure, and cause landslides. But it differs from the nightmare scenario of one continuous coast-to-coast rupture. Instead, different sections behave in different ways. The western segments produce more regular earthquakes, including magnitude 7.2 events roughly every 150 years. The eastern sections generate smaller double quakes, back-to-back events between magnitude 6.2 and 6.8 about every century, and a magnitude 7.0 roughly every 500 years. Parts of the fault don't snap at all, but creep. Scientists call it shallow creep, which just means the fault slowly slides without producing a major quake. It releases tension quietly, like letting air out of a balloon instead of popping it. GPS measurements and clusters of repeating small quakes over the past 20 years confirm that slow slip near the central basin. So what does this mean for Istanbul? A city of over 15 million people sitting practically on top of this system. A magnitude 7 or 7.3 quake close to the city could still rock neighborhoods, especially if two strong events strike in quick succession. Infrastructure, older buildings, and densely packed districts are at the highest risk. The fault hasn't produced a major rupture in this section since 1894, which means there's more than 130 years of accumulated strain. The simulations show major events could strike in the coming decades. Then there's Santorini, where more than 28,000 earthquakes happened in just a few months in early 2025. Most of the quakes stayed small, but some reached magnitude 5, strong enough to fracture walls, rattle nerves, and push authorities to close schools and evacuate parts of the island. And this wasn't just tectonic plates grinding like they usually do. This swarm moved. The epicenters shifted gradually northeast toward the Colombo submarine volcano about 5 miles offshore. That migration told scientists magma was on the move. Researchers calculated that roughly 80 billion gallons of it, enough to fill about 120,000 Olympic swimming pools, surged upward from depths around 11 miles beneath the surface. It climbed fast, then stalled about 2 to 2.5 miles below the seafloor. And all this was going on along the Hellenic Arc, one of Europe's most active subduction zones, where the African plate dives beneath the Eurasian region. Earthquakes often migrate across that span toward nearby islands. History backs that up. The 1956 Amorgos earthquakes unleashed massive shaking and a tsunami across the region. So, when 28,000 tremors light up the seismic network, you pay attention. This episode changed how scientists understand volcanic swarms. Now they know magma can intrude, fracture miles of crust, reshape underground reservoirs, and still never surface. It can load the system for the future without pulling the trigger today. And that matters because when magma moves like this, it changes stress fields underground and how future quakes might breed. The good news is that scientists now have really cool monitoring tools that feed real-time seismic feeds, underwater pressure sensors, and repeated gas measurements near volcanic vents into integrated hazard models. If magma starts accelerating upward again, researchers will see it and will take action. And there's another bold new idea in earthquake and tsunami warning: using undersea internet cables for this purpose. Nearly 1 million miles of those fiber optic lines on the seabed were designed to carry data, but scientists discovered that they can also detect tiny changes in light signals caused by seismic vibrations. In simple terms, when the ground shakes, the cable feels it. And this could be incredibly useful because forecasting earthquakes, even on land, is tricky. In the ocean, it has felt almost impossible as you can't scatter thousands of sensors across the seafloor easily. But those cables already sit there, stretching across deep trenches and continental shelves. If researchers use them as sensors, they can monitor tectonic movement in real time across huge areas. For a region like the Mediterranean, with hidden faults, active volcanoes, and crowded coasts, that system could offer precious seconds or minutes of warning. Seconds sound small, but early alerts let trains stop, gas lines shut down, and people move away from immediate danger. The fiber optic cable used for Seafloor Project, or FOCUS in the short version, didn't warn anyone about real disasters yet, but it had 2 false alarms. It reacted to a submarine landslide and weight bags that pushed the cables down. It proves the system works and could be life-saving in case of real danger, especially in vulnerable regions such as the Mediterranean. It shaped civilizations for thousands of years, and now science reveals it still shapes itself. They can't stop tectonic plates or cool magma chambers, but they can understand patterns, reduce vulnerability, and design cities smarter.
A network of deep faults runs right beneath Seattle, and it can shift at any moment, affecting millions of people. The consequences could be as catastrophic as in the past, when a devastating quake lifted the seafloor, collapsed shorelines, and triggered a massive tsunami. It happened in the winter of the year 923. A powerful earthquake hit what is now the Seattle area, It reached around magnitude 7.5, and the impact was terrifying. The ground didn't just shake violently, it shifted. Shorelines collapsed, parts of the seafloor lifted upward, and a tsunami swept through Puget Sound, flooding coastal areas. This event came from the Seattle Fault Zone. This is a complex system of faults that runs directly beneath modern-day Seattle, and it's still active today. This makes it one of the most dangerous geologic threats in the Pacific Northwest. Now, what threat does it present? Well, if a similar earthquake happened now, it would hit a densely populated region, putting millions of people at risk. It would also cause billions of dollars in damage to buildings, roads, and infrastructure. Scientists have started studying this fault more closely to understand how often it produces major earthquakes. They looked at the past 11,000 years to analyze time gaps between large seismic events. Well, the results are kinda mixed. On the one hand, devastating earthquakes, like the one that hit in 923, seem to be extremely rare. In fact, it's the only known quake of that size, magnitude 7.5 or higher, linked to this fault zone. So we can hope that the worst-case scenario, where massive earthquakes like this happen often, is unlikely. But researchers have also made a rather worrying discovery. Smaller earthquakes happen more frequently than expected. And while these quakes may not reach magnitude 7.5, they can still damage buildings, crack roads, disrupt utilities, and trigger landslides. In a modern city like Seattle, even a moderate earthquake can cause really serious problems. In other words, the region still faces regular seismic risk. The fault is active, the pressure builds over time, and the ground can move again. The real danger is the ongoing threat of smaller but still destructive earthquakes, and they may strike with little warning. Now let's take a closer look at the Seattle Fault Zone. It's this huge fault system sitting right under Seattle, a whole network that stretches about 46 miles from the mountains east of the city, all the way to the water on the west side. And yes, it runs directly under Seattle. It's a thrust fault, which means one chunk of ground is slowly pushing up over another. That pressure builds up for a long time, and then suddenly releases. That's when you get a big earthquake. Scientists didn't really start digging into this until the 1990s, when they noticed strange gravity readings. Plus, they found signs that a tsunami had hit the area about 1,000 years ago. All of that pointed to one thing: something catastrophic happened here before, most likely that huge earthquake back in 923. But there was a problem. The data they had managed to gather only went back about 5,000 years. This certainly isn't enough to see a clear pattern. So researchers decided to dig deeper and turn to something called marine terraces. These are old coastlines that got pushed upward by earthquakes and now form something like steps along the shore. Now, an important detail. The 923 earthquake lifted the land by about 26 feet. So scientists started looking for other terraces with the same kind of shift. They mapped out more than 150 of these terraces around Puget Sound, measuring their height and adjusting for natural slopes. It turned out that only one event in an 11,000-year window caused a big uplift like that: the 923 earthquake. As for smaller quakes, those could be hidden under layers of sediment. It means that huge city-shaking earthquakes are very rare, possibly with 5,000 years or even more between them. But it doesn't mean the danger is gone. Smaller ones are what we should worry about. They hit way more often, and they can do serious damage. That's why researchers focused on smaller side faults. Those are called blind faults because you can't see them at the surface, but they can still trigger strong earthquakes, and they already have. One of these smaller faults caused a magnitude 6.7 quake in the past. That's strong enough to damage buildings, crack roads, and mess up infrastructure. So the team pulled together a bunch of tools, like magnetic scans, fieldwork, LiDAR maps. They even dug trenches across fault lines and used dating methods to figure out when past quakes occurred. In the end, they found 3 more earthquakes. One happened around 11,000 years ago. One more hit in the early 1800s. That's a pretty big gap. But it proves these smaller faults have been active for a long time. But the most worrying thing is that these quakes didn't line up with movement on the main fault. That means the smaller faults can rupture on their own. When the team added all this new data together, they saw a pattern. Smaller quakes hit about every 350 years over the last 2,500 years. That's more frequent than scientists used to think. And this activity seems to have picked up over the last 2,000 years. Now, researchers are trying to figure out how big these quakes can actually get, how often they hit, and what would happen if one struck today. But it's not so simple. They have to piece the whole picture together from rocks, layers of soil, and tiny clues they find underground. So, where does it leave Seattle? Well, there's a national system called the Seismic Hazard Model. It's what engineers and planners use to decide how strong buildings need to be, how to design infrastructure, that kind of thing. Right now, this system includes the big 923-style quake, but it doesn't really account for the smaller side faults. First of all, these faults are shorter than what the model usually considers. Second, we're still unsure about how powerful their quakes can get. That's why the model should probably be updated, and authorities need to start planning for those more frequent quakes. It could directly affect building codes and safety plans. Now, despite this worrying news, there are other even more dangerous faults on Earth. Like the San Andreas fault. It cuts through California for about 800 miles. It's where 2 massive plates slide past each other sideways. That constant grinding builds pressure and then releases it fast. That's how you get quakes like the 1906 San Francisco disaster. Today, millions of people live right on top of it, so scientists track every, even the tiniest tremor with sensors, watching for signs of a bigger break. Then, there's the North Anatolian Fault that runs about 930 miles across Turkey. It tends to break in a chain reaction, one quake triggering the next along the line. In 1999, one of those breaks hit Izmit and took the lives of over 17,000 people. Now the stress is building closer to Istanbul, and that's a city with over 15 million people. The Sumatra subduction zone in Indonesia is where one plate dives under another, locking up tons of energy. In 2004, it unleashed a magnitude 9.1 quake and a tsunami that more than 230,000 people didn't survive. It's still active today, and scientists constantly monitor the seafloor and ocean pressure to catch tsunami signals as early as possible. The Alpi Belt stretches over 1,500 miles from southern Europe to Asia. It once helped build mountain ranges like the Alps. Here, plates crash into each other and push land upward. Quakes don't occur here often, but when they do, they can be powerful and hit heavily populated regions. Japan also sits right where several plates collide. It's one of the most earthquake-prone places on Earth. In 2011, a massive offshore quake triggered a tsunami and the Fukushima disaster. Since then, Japan has built one of the most advanced monitoring systems in the world. Thousands of sensors track ground movement in real time to send out warnings within seconds. Across countries like France, Australia, and the United States, homes are starting to lose their shape. Walls crack and foundations move. Millions of homes are at risk, and yours might be next. The cause isn't earthquakes. The ground itself is shifting. It often starts small, a thin crack on a living room wall. But over time, that line spreads, grows wider, and becomes hard to ignore. Across Australia, more and more homes are starting to show such cracks, all because a long, record-breaking drought is drying out the ground beneath them. And when soil loses moisture, it shrinks. As a result, the foundations of a house can shift unevenly. which puts a lot of stress on the structure. Walls begin to move, and cracks appear. Now, some types of soil make the problem even worse, especially clay. It reacts a lot to water. When it rains, clay soil soaks up the water and swells. When it dries out, it shrinks, kind of like a sponge. The problem is, many areas haven't had much rain for months, and in some places, almost a year. So the soil is drying out way more than it normally would. Recent data shows how extreme the situation has become. Australia experienced one of the hottest and driest years on record. Soil moisture levels have dropped way below average across most of the country. In some parts of New South Wales, especially along the east coast, conditions have worsened quickly. By December, around 48% of the state had soil moisture levels far below average, up from 25% just 1 month earlier. At the same time, plants and trees are trying to survive by pulling even more water from the ground, drying the soil out further and speeding up the process. The result is a vicious cycle. The ground keeps shrinking and foundations keep shifting. Many homeowners, especially around Sydney, spot new cracks or notice old ones grow worse, sometimes in just a few weeks. Moving on to France, more than half of its mainland territory, about 55%, is now classified as being at medium or high risk of house cracking caused by clay soil movement. That's up from 48% in 2020, and it affects more than 12 million homes. Homes built since the 1970s are more at risk because, back then, builders used smaller and shallower foundations. These foundations don't cope well when the ground starts to move. That's why newer rules, introduced in 2024, now require stronger foundations. They have better chances to properly protect homes. A severe drought in 2023, followed by extreme heat, led to a sharp rise in cracks. In some cases, areas can be officially declared natural disaster zones. It allows homeowners to get insurance support for repairs. But it's not that simple. Claims for damage caused by clay soil come with a higher excess, about $1,800, compared with $450 for other types of damage. And proving the damage isn't always easy. One house may crack while the one next door stays fine, which makes it harder to connect the problem directly to weather conditions. Now let's see what's happening in the USA. Carol Devon first thought that her suburban St. Louis home was just settling when small cracks appeared in the walls. But when large gaps opened between her fireplace and the ceiling, and her family room began to tilt, she realized the problem was far more serious. Scott Noche, a 48-year-old physical therapist in Lee's Summit, Missouri, is installing 33 piers, each costing around $1,000 at his two-story home. With added costs for rebuilding the driveway, sidewalks, and landscaping, his total repair bill is expected to reach about $50,000. He first noticed problems last summer when drywall started cracking and doors began sticking. But the situation got even worse during a drought. His back deck sank by about 10 inches, and inside the house, rooms began to tilt, some by up to 4 inches, making movement difficult. Nearly every home on his street has needed similar repairs in recent years. Across the United States, thousands of homeowners are facing the same situation. Movements of soil crack foundations, damage basements, and spread upward into walls and structures. In some areas, gaps wide enough to fit a hand are forming around houses. In many cases, repairs cost tens of thousands of dollars and can even exceed $100,000, often without insurance coverage. In any case, insurance rarely helps. Most policies cover sudden events like fires or floods, not slow ground movement caused by drought. In many cases, claims for this type of damage are denied. Repair companies are struggling to keep up. Cases have been reported in about 40 of the 48 contiguous states, and total damage could go over $1 billion. Cities like St. Louis, where many homes were built with heavy brick structures, experience more damage, because brick houses put more weight on foundations than lighter wood or siding homes. This increases strain when the ground moves. Fixing the damage is expensive because it's not just patching cracks. In many cases, contractors must install steel piers under the house to stabilize it. They drive such piers deep into the ground, sometimes down to bedrock, using hydraulic equipment, and the process is very costly. The main thing here is prevention. Homeowners should watch for gaps forming in the soil near foundations and, if possible, keep the ground evenly moist. Some also use mulch around the house to slow water loss from the soil. The thing is, cracks in walls can look worrying, but in many cases, they don't mean that your house is falling apart. If the soil your house is built on shrinks and swells, depending on the amount of moisture, these cracks might come and go with the seasons. They're likely non-structural, meaning they do not usually affect the safety of the house and its inhabitants. To understand the problem better, you should first check what type of soil your house is built on. You can ask local councils or request geotechnical reports from building permits. They might give you this information. There are ways to reduce the movement of your house, but most are easier to apply during construction. For example, stronger foundations can help, but they're expensive and not always practical for already existing homes. Once cracking has started, it is difficult to fully stop it. You can only control how much moisture the soil around the house gets. Some people try removing trees near the house, since roots can draw water from the soil. But this can actually backfire. Cutting trees can suddenly change moisture levels in the ground and make the soil even more unstable. Another way is to build a barrier around the house, like a concrete strip or paved area. This pushes the wet and dry zones away from the walls and helps reduce soil movement right under the house. Watering lawns is also tricky. Too little water dries the soil too much, but too much water can create uneven moisture around the house and cause more movement instead of less. So, as you see, there is no simple fix. Experts recommend getting a professional assessment before taking action. An independent structural engineer or building consultant can help identify whether cracks are harmless or part of a bigger problem. Over the past century, human activity has trapped more heat in the Earth's atmosphere. This extra heat is changing the planet's climate, and scientists say Earth is now holding more energy than it releases. Because of this, the weather is becoming more extreme, with terrible storms and droughts. In some places, strong snowstorms block roads and disrupt transport. In the United States, tornado seasons are becoming more intense than expected. In other regions, heavy rain causes flash floods and serious damage. The year 2025 was one of the hottest years ever recorded. Most of this extra heat doesn't stay in the air. It goes into the oceans instead. About 91% of it is absorbed by the sea, which is warming ocean water and disturbing marine life. Scientists warn that if this continues, ocean systems could reach dangerous tipping points. Hey, can you lift a truck with your hands? No? Shocker. But let me introduce you to nature's original strongman, the ocean, which casually tossed 700-ton boulders around like they were pebbles during a mega tsunami that hit Africa thousands of years ago. This wasn't just a bad day at the beach. This mega tsunami was so powerful, it made the 2004 Indonesian and 2011 Japanese tsunamis look like kiddie pool splashes. Now, to give you an idea of how terrifying regular tsunamis already are, the Japan tsunami produced waves 133 feet tall. The Indian Ocean tsunami was slightly smaller, but it took over 200,000 lives across many countries. Now imagine something way worse. You see, for a long time, scientists thought waves that big were just science fiction. But then they found these enormous boulders, massive chunks of rock, flung far inland, and did the math. It turns out only waves around 800 feet tall could have pulled off that kind of rocky vandalism. And the culprit? A volcano that literally fell apart into the ocean and triggered one of the most powerful tsunamis Earth has ever seen. Usually, tsunamis are blamed on underwater earthquakes, tectonic plates getting into slap fights. But volcanoes? Oh, they've got tsunami potential too. In 1883, for example, a volcano in Indonesia named Krakatoa erupted for 6 months non-stop until it exploded, and the explosion was heard all the way in Australia. This triggered many tsunamis, some almost 100 feet tall. Still, that was more like a toe dip compared to the full cannonball from the mega tsunami. Back in ancient times, the volcano that crumbled during the mega tsunami was huge, and it didn't just fall apart. It lost a chunk that was 10 times the size of Mount Everest. 10 Mount Everests. It was like the Earth wanted to see what would happen if we threw a mountain into the ocean just for fun. It was so massive that when the entire side of the volcano belly flopped into the Atlantic, it created waves that could cover the Statue of Liberty 3 times. It also destroyed an island more than 30 miles away. The volcano behind this real-life Michael Bay scene was called Fogo, located on, you guessed it, Fogo Island. This island is basically just a whole single volcano that rose from the sea thanks to a magma hotspot, a place in the ocean where a lot of magma escapes and erupts like an underwater volcano. Over time, this magma cooled and stacked up like pancakes until, voila, after 7 major eruptions, the island popped out of the ocean like it was playing peekaboo. Surprise, it's a volcano. But Fogo's dramatic entrance was also a ticking time bomb. You see, the more a volcano grows, the heavier it gets, and if there's not enough magma inside it to support it, the whole thing can just collapse. Sometimes it doesn't take much. A minor earthquake, some erosion, or just a poor foundation made of soft sediment can trigger a collapse. It's like a really tall guy trying to balance over a bunch of marbles. Fogo had all the bad luck ingredients: too tall, too heavy, and built on squishy ground. And it gets worse. As the volcano grows heavier, it starts squishing the magma underneath. That lava can't rise, so it just simmers down there, slowly thickening like soup left on a burner for too long. Gases build up, pressure increases, and eventually, kaboom! It's the volcanic version of eating too many burritos and then trying to hold in a sneeze. This massive pressure and imbalance can trigger what's called a flank collapse, which is science speak for oops, half the volcano just fell into the ocean. That's what happened with Fogo. Most of the volcanic islands that form this way are long gone, but Fogo is still very much alive and kicking. In fact, it last erupted in 2014, and considering that it goes off every 20 years, maybe don't travel to Fogo Island in around 2034. For the longest time, scientists believe only big, bulky volcanic islands could collapse like this. But new research says that even smaller, skinnier guys, like the Danny DeVitos of the island world, aren't safe either. The thing is that small volcanic islands only seem stable because of their small mass. It's like Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger both slipping on the ice. Arnie's fall might cause more chaos, but Danny can still go flying. And those little collapses? Yes, they matter. Take Santa Maria, a tiny island that's about 170 times smaller than Hawaii. It has collapsed multiple times, not because it wanted to, but because it's basically standing on soggy breadcrumbs. Its foundation is loose marine sediment, and to make things worse, it's sitting right next to the East Azores Fault, where 3 tectonic plates meet up for daily slap fights. This fault is responsible for many earthquakes and even some tsunamis that happened in Lisbon in the past, so you can imagine what it's like living right above it. Every time the volcano in Santa Maria erupts and grows, it also sinks. But when a chunk collapses, it bounces back up like a buoy. This seamount to island again roller coaster means that Santa Maria has popped in and out of the ocean like a submarine playing peekaboo. And with every peak comes a potential tsunami. Another volcano with similar trust issues is Pacaya, located in Guatemala. Between 2011 and 2013, scientists spotted strange movements in the soil, tiny shifts that suggested something underneath was getting restless. Sure enough, in 2014, Pacaya erupted. Luckily, it didn't collapse, But that risk still looms, especially if magma gets trapped in it like it did with Fogo. The consequences could be explosive, literally. In fact, about 1,000 years ago, Pikaia experienced a collapse that sent debris avalanches more than 15 miles away. Since then, it's rebuilt itself like a fiery phoenix, but it could still crumble again. That's why volcanologists obsess over the tiniest wobbles. It's not paranoia if the mountain really might fall. Now you might be thinking here, okay, but that was the past. Surely that kind of ridiculous mega tsunami collapse can't happen again, right? Well, welcome to the 21st century. Islands like Hawaii, La Palma in Spain, and various parts of the Caribbean are sitting on the same kind of geological whoopee cushions. All it takes is the right combo: loose foundation, steep slopes, maybe some trapped magma, and boom, flank collapse. In fact, it's already happened recently. In 2018, Anak Krakatau, the volcanic baby of the infamous Krakatoa, lost a big chunk of itself during an eruption. It caused a tsunami, but it was more awkward than devastating, like a volcano losing its pants on stage. Embarrassing, but survivable. But that's just amateur hour compared to history's real showstoppers. Ritter Island's 1888 collapse was so intense that the island literally got shorter. It went from being more than 2,000 feet tall to a mere 460 feet. But the record holder is the legendary Latua Bay megasplash from 1958, where a 7.8 magnitude earthquake triggered a massive landslide that sent a wave taller than the Empire State Building roaring through Alaska at highway speeds. Strangely enough, only 5 people lost their lives here, but on the other hand, the destruction path it left behind can still be seen today, all the way from space. Melting glaciers and ice caps can make volcanoes collapse too. When they melt, there's a sudden decrease in pressure on Earth's crust that can destabilize entire volcanoes. It's called isostatic rebound. It's like suddenly yanking a chair out from under someone who's been sitting still for centuries. Whoops. Also, here's something you probably never thought you'd worry about on your island getaway. Some volcanic islands grow outward as lava pours into the sea, creating unstable platforms known as lava deltas. These deltas can collapse without warning, taking newly formed land, and sometimes tourists too, right back into the ocean. No pressure though, just thought, maybe you want to stay off steaming new land. So yeah, next time you're lounging on a beachy volcanic island thinking, wow, this place is paradise, just remember, it might also be a ticking geological time bomb with a flair for the dramatic. From ancient mountain-sized cannonballs to surprise lava deltas, volcanoes have a history of keeping things spicy.
"7,500 years ago, the Pacific floor collapsed. Massive landslides buried the seabed in seconds. Fast forward to today, robot subs have examined the place. Scans have revealed proof of at least 10 distinct cyclical megaquakes. Now, researchers warn, the plates are still locked and building pressure, even today. If they start moving, that could trigger new red alert earthquakes and send disastrous tsunamis toward the coast. Let's look at the map. The fault here is like a giant zipper. It's over 600 miles, stretching from northern California to Canada. It's called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and it's a part of the Ring of Fire. You know, the famous giant horseshoe around the Pacific that can serve as your where-to-go reminder if you're into volcanic and earthquake tourism. One of Cascadia's biggest events happened around the year 1700. There are no local written records of it, but there is a story. A well-known indigenous legend tells of an epic battle between a thunderbird and a whale. In the story, the thunderbird's wing beats make the ground shake. The whale's thrashing sends seawater flooding inland. The thunderbird wins by finally grabbing the whale and slamming it back down, shaking the land itself. Many researchers believe that this legend originated from the real earthquake of 1700. But we don't just have cool myths to give us the full picture. In the early 1700s, samurai officials recorded waves flooding villages and rice fields. But nobody felt the earthquake that must come first. That's why they nicknamed this event the Orphan Tsunami. But it did have a parent, and it took scientists 300 years to finally connect it back to Cascadia. To see Cascadia's past, researchers sent robot subs to scan the bottom in crazy detail. They expected to see a simple crack, but what they found looked more like giant underwater steps. Some of those steps are about 33 feet tall, like a 3-story building. That only happens when a big piece of the seafloor snaps off, breaks loose, and slides all at once, not slowly. When that happens, it kicks up a mud avalanche. Picture a jar of dirt and water. Shake it hard, and a fresh layer settles at the bottom. Each layer is basically a timestamp from a huge quake. When scientists counted and dated them, they found 10 separate megaquakes that hit one after the other over thousands of years. That means that Cascadia doesn't let pressure out little by little. It stays stuck for a long time, then suddenly breaks out violently. That pattern is why the Cascadia subduction zone is considered one of the scariest fault systems in North America today. So what's actually happening down there? The plates aren't sliding smoothly, they're stuck. And while they're stuck, the coastline is getting quietly bent out of shape like a ruler you're flexing in your hands. It doesn't look dramatic day to day, but it's been loading up for centuries. When that tension finally snaps, the coast will instantly drop. Geologists call this co-seismic subsidence. We're talking about the ground plunging 6 to 8 feet vertically in a matter of minutes. Imagine standing on a beach. The shaking stops, and you realize the ocean is rushing in. Not just because of a wave, but because the land you're standing on has physically sunk below sea level. That one move is enough to shove the seafloor out of position and force the ocean above it to react. Cascadia can produce a magnitude 9.0. That's top tier, categorized as the most destructive natural event that can happen. It can shake the ground for minutes, pushing and pulling everything back and forth until buildings and bridges start falling down. A 9.0 class quake also means the seafloor is vibrating and shifting, lifting in some spots, dropping in others, all in one sudden motion. A tsunami starts when the seafloor moves and pushes a huge amount of water out of the way. If the bottom suddenly lifts or drops, the water above it gets displaced instantly. That water has to go somewhere, so it races outward in every direction. Out in deep water, that wave is rarely tall. It spreads out across a long distance, so it can pass under ships without anyone noticing. The danger is speed. In the open ocean, tsunamis can travel around 500 to 600 miles per hour. That's like traveling from New York to Detroit in 60 minutes. Eventually, the ocean starts to pile up, getting taller by the second. Near shore, it can stack up to tens of feet, and in extreme cases, it can run up to 100 feet on land. It swallows the coast, then drags everything back to sea with a violent tug before the next hit arrives. But that's not all. When the fault snaps, it often triggers massive underwater landslides. When a huge chunk of seafloor collapses, it can shove water locally, like dropping a boulder into a tub. In the Cascadia subduction zone, you aren't just dealing with the earthquake's kick. You're getting a 1-2 punch from the shifting crust and the crumbling slopes combined. On parts of the Oregon coast, emergency experts say the shaking could last 5 to 7 minutes, long enough to realize what's happening and still won't be over. Then comes the scariest part. In some places, a tsunami can hit in 15 to 30 minutes. Remember, the earthquake is a warning. If you're on the coast and you feel strong, long shaking, you do not need to wait for a text alert or a siren, or someone on the news to yell tsunami. During the tremors, the basic recommendation is to literally drop to the ground, cover, and hold on, staying away from windows and chandeliers that can fall on you. As tempting as it is, we shouldn't stop to make a reel out of the situation. Before anything happens, make one decision while your brain is calm. Pick the closest high ground and go for it. Not somewhere uphill, an actual spot. If you ever needed a reason to learn your neighborhood, this is it. Your instinct might say, get into the car and drive. But don't. Roads are probably jammed and bridges could be damaged. People who live on the coast already know to keep it practical, with shoes on the bed and a go bag prepared just in case. The danger doesn't end with the first impact because the tsunami waves, well, they come in waves. The initial hit is rarely the largest, and the ocean can continue to pulse in and out for hours. This creates a violent tug-of-war. The receding water acts like a massive vacuum, dragging anything caught in the backwash out to sea. Japan's 2011 disaster is the most recent vivid example of what a magnitude 9.1 can do. The seafloor shifted in a single massive heave, and minutes later, the ocean literally rearranged the coast. A huge wall of water crashed inland, reaching over 100 feet high in some spots, and turning the coastline into a conveyor belt of debris. It was like water turned cars into giant bowling balls and shipping containers into massive metal bricks, smashing ports and drowning low-lying airports and electrical substations. Finally, what do officials say about the timeline for the possible next disaster hitting Cascadia? Well, they can't give us precise dates, but they did announce some odds. For the biggest, scariest earthquake possible, the United States Geological Survey says there is about a 10% to 15% chance it'll happen in the next 50 years. Chances for a quake that isn't the mega version are 1 in 3 in the next 5 decades. Those odds are actually pretty high. But here is why it isn't all that grim. Scientists know this isn't random. Cascadia has a pattern, and patterns are what preparation runs on. We already know how to build for big shaking, and we're getting better at spotting where stress is building. It doesn't mean we can stop the earthquake, but it means we're getting way better at knowing what to expect. In the meantime, just keep a go bag by the door and maybe take a walk around your neighborhood every once in a while. It's one of America's strangest contradictions. The Northeast, the cradle of cities, commerce, and crowds, hides a vast, empty wilderness at its northern edge. Millions live packed together to the south, yet up here, there's space for everyone, and almost no one takes it. How did this happen? How did the heart of America's most crowded region end up with one of its loneliest frontiers? The northeastern United States is home to more than 50 million people. It's one of the busiest and most densely packed regions in all of America. But almost 90% of those people live in the southern half of it. If you go north, past big cities and highways, everything will change. The noise will fade and the lights will thin out. You'll find yourself in a different world. A quiet land of forests, lakes, and mountains, stretching across northern New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. This is America's empty Northeast. And the mystery is simple. Why is this part of one of the most crowded regions in the country so empty? First of all, let's take a look at New England itself. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are bursting at the seams, while Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire feel wide open. Connecticut sits in the middle, literally and figuratively. Massachusetts is basically the crowd magnet. Most people live around Boston and the cities nearby, Cambridge, Worcester, Springfield, where everything's close, busy, and built up. Rhode Island may be tiny, but it's got a big city density. Connecticut sits right between Boston and New York, and it shows. It has a busy coastline and quieter inland towns. It's not too crowded and not too empty. The middle ground. Once you cross into New Hampshire, things slow down. There's Manchester and Nashua, but most of the state is forests, lakes, and open land. Then there's Vermont, easily the least crowded region of the bunch. The Green Mountains slice through the middle, and most people live in small towns or villages. And Maine is huge and mostly empty. Most people stick to the southern coast. If you head north, you'll hit endless forests, lakes, and long, quiet roads. It's beautiful, but it feels like the edge of the map. Today, the northern half of the Northeast, northern New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, holds only about 4.9 million people. That's roughly the same as the population of the Boston metro area alone. To put that in perspective, if you take southern New York and southern New England, about the same land area, you get 10 times as many people living there. So, why the gap? It all comes back to geography, history, and economics, and how they've always worked together to keep the North empty. Let's start with the land itself. The thing is, the farther north you go, the rougher the land gets. Southern New England and downstate New York are full of rolling hills, wide valleys, and coastal plains. But then come the mountains. They're old, crumbling, and wild. In northern New York, you'll see the Adirondacks. To their east, the Green Mountains run up the middle of Vermont, stretching into Quebec. Keep going and you hit the White Mountains of New Hampshire. They're home to Mount Washington, famous for some of the most severe weather on Earth. And beyond that, the western Maine Mountains roll on toward Canada. Those aren't gentle hills, they're real barriers, and they owe their shape to one of the most powerful forces in Earth's history: ice. During the last ice age, huge glaciers covered this land. When they finally retreated, they carved out deep valleys and left behind thin, rocky soil. Later, the basins filled with water, creating thousands of lakes and ponds. It's a beautiful but difficult land to live on. Farming never stood a chance here the way it did farther south, where the soil is way richer. So the mountains stayed wild, covered in dense forests that even today stretch for miles. Northern Maine and the Adirondacks together make up one of the largest continuous forests east of the Mississippi. For centuries, people have come here to cut timber, fish, or hunt, but never in great numbers. And then there's the weather. Up here, winters are long, dark, and cold. Snow piles up early and doesn't leave easily. Summers are short, and the growing season is barely long enough to farm. It's not exactly a place that says, "Come start a new life." But of course, some people did. And here's where history comes into play. Long before Europeans arrived, this land was home to indigenous nations. The Abenaki, living across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, had complex trade routes, connecting their communities all the way from modern Quebec to Massachusetts. Farther west, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy extended its influence toward the Adirondacks, controlling vast hunting grounds and trade routes. Then came the Europeans. In the 1600s, French explorers and fur traders pushed south from Quebec. They set up outposts along rivers and lakes that linked the region to Canada. They saw opportunity: furs, fish, timber, but not farmland. The dense forests and harsh winters kept settlements small and scattered. The English, expanding north from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, took to the coast. They settled in southern Maine and New Hampshire, but going inland was another story. Between the cold, the forests, and the resistance from native nations, their progress was slow and dangerous. For more than a century, the interior of the northern Northeast stayed wild. Later, around the 1760s, the British took control of the region. Land speculators moved in, especially in Vermont, which both New York and New Hampshire claimed as their own. The overlapping claims led to chaos, and eventually, Vermont declared itself an independent republic in 1777. For 14 years, it existed on its own until it joined the United States in 1791 as the 14th state. New Hampshire pushed inland from the coast, building towns in the valleys between its granite mountains. Maine, meanwhile, spent centuries as parts of Massachusetts. Its economy ran on timber and shipbuilding. Trees turned into masts and planks for the growing British and later American navies. And in northern New York, the Adirondacks remained a wild frontier long after the rest of the state filled up. The land was too rugged and the winters too fierce. Logging, mining, and later tourism would bring people north, but never in huge numbers. By the mid-1800s, the southern parts of New England were booming. Cities were growing, factories were humming, and immigrants were arriving in large numbers. But the northern regions stayed quiet. So as we now know, the mountains are the first big barrier. They make everything harder: travel, building, farming, and surviving winter. The soil is thin, rocky, and poor. And what's underneath isn't much better. The region doesn't have rich mineral deposits or coal seams like the Appalachians farther south. Without valuable resources to mine or easy land to farm, there wasn't much reason for settlers to stay. That was one of the reasons why the economy never took off. The empty Northeast never became a center of industry. Southern New England had rivers that powered early factories, ports connected it to global trade, and the cities attracted millions of immigrants. Northern New England and Northern New York had none of that. They had lumber, granite, and paper mills, all useful, but those industries didn't create huge cities. Even today, the economy up there relies on the same resources, along with tourism. People come to hike, ski, fish, and escape city life, but most don't stay year-round. Towns fill up in summer and fall, then empty out when the snow starts falling. A few small cities, Portland, Burlington, Manchester, thrive, but there's no Boston or New York up here. You won't find massive universities, corporate headquarters, or international airports to pull in young people and families. In fact, some states have gone so far as to pay people to move there. Maine and Vermont have both launched programs offering money to remote workers who relocate. That's a pretty desperate attempt to reverse decades of population decline. Today, this empty Northeast holds just about 1% of America's population. It's a land of deep woods, icy lakes, and quiet towns. The wilderness never really left this region. But that stillness is also what makes this place so special. The rest of the Northeast is filled with constant noise and motion. Meanwhile, the North is a reminder of what the region once was: wild, cold, and untamed. That's how the heart of America's most crowded region remains one of its last true frontiers.
Something enormous is hiding right below Hawaii, deeper than any drill could ever reach. This strange underground bubble, almost 1,800 miles down, tells us impressive new details about the formation of the islands and could cause an eruption that will affect thousands of lives. Scientists call strange formations like this blob ultra-low velocity zones. When earthquakes happen, they send vibrations through the planet, and they move fast through most rocks, but they slow way down when they pass through certain deep layers. That slowdown tells geologists something unusual sits there. The giant blob beneath Hawaii belongs to the biggest category of these structures, a mega ultra-low velocity zone. A massive chunk of material sitting right on the border between Earth's mantle and its core. To find out what this monster actually looks like, scientists track two different types of earthquake waves. The first type, pressure waves, compresses rock like squeezing a spring. Another type, shear waves, moves rock up and down like shaking a rope. When they combined both signals, researchers built a much clearer picture of what lies deep below Hawaii. Scientists used to think that this blob was soft and partially melted, like thick lava slowly rising toward the surface. But this new seismic data showed that the blob isn't gooey at all. It's mostly solid rock, dense, heavy, and packed with iron. This discovery helps explain a real mystery that puzzled scientists for decades. Most volcanoes form along the edges of tectonic plates, but Hawaii doesn't sit anywhere near one of those boundaries. It floats right in the middle of the Pacific Plate. Yet the islands somehow form from some of the most active volcanoes on the planet. They used to explain this with a hot spot, a column of heat rising from deep inside the Earth like a blowtorch slowly melting its way upward. But now, it turns out that the giant iron-rich blob anchors that heat plume in place, like the base of a lava lamp that keeps the flow steady for millions of years. The material the structure is made of could even be leftovers from a basal magma ocean. a gigantic layer of molten rock that may have existed deep inside Earth when the planet first formed. When that ancient ocean cooled and crystallized, heavy elements like iron sank downward and created dense pockets, and the blob under Hawaii might be one of those survivors. Now, structures like this don't just sit quietly forever. Heat constantly flows through Earth's mantle, and when those flows shift, they can tug on deep structures, redirect heat, and sometimes destabilize them. If the system beneath Hawaii ever changes in a major way, it could intensify the volcanic activity above. We already see hints of that restless energy. Hawaii has thousands of earthquakes every year. Most of them are tiny, so small that only sensitive instruments detect them. On average, Hawaii has about 100 magnitude 3 earthquakes per year. Those are strong enough for people to feel. Roughly 10 quakes reach magnitude 4 annually, and about 1 magnitude 5 quake shakes the islands every year. Bigger events happen less often, but they still happen. Most of this activity is going on around the Big Island, which has several volcanoes. In early March 2026, Kilauea launched fountains of lava nearly 1,300 feet into the air. Bright red streams of molten rock blasted upward, and ash and volcanic fragments rained down across nearby areas. Authorities temporarily closed parts of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and sections of Highway 11 because falling debris created dangerous conditions. The eruption didn't threaten homes directly, but it still caused real problems. Ash drifted across nearby communities, and tiny rock fragments coated roads and rooftops. All that activity connects to the same deep engine, the hotspot anchored by that enormous iron-rich blob nearly 1,800 miles beneath the islands. Now, let's travel north, where something pretty scary lurks beneath the western edge of North America. Something capable of reshaping the entire coastline. Scientists think that two giant earthquake faults, the Cascadia subduction zone and the San Andreas fault, don't just exist side by side, but may actually affect each other and act like giant dominoes. Cascadia stretches along the Pacific Northwest, and the San Andreas cuts through California. Scientists found evidence for this possible impact on the ocean floor. They pulled long cylinders of mud and sediment, and these cores are like geological history books that preserve layers of debris from ancient earthquakes. Inside those layers, researchers saw that pairs of earthquake deposits sit almost on top of each other. Geologists call them doublets. Two massive quakes struck so close together in time that the ocean barely had time to settle between them. And that discovery points straight to one of the most chaotic tectonic zones on the planet, the Mendocino Triple Junction. This is where three tectonic plates collide and grind together, like crooked gears inside a machine. It's also the exact place where the San Andreas Fault meets the Cascadia subduction zone. Now, when one fault ruptures, it sends shockwaves of stress through the crust. That stress can destabilize the neighboring fault and push it toward breaking too. A Cascadia megaquake alone could reach magnitude 9 or higher. That kind of earthquake could tear open 600 to 700 miles of seafloor and send a massive tsunami racing toward the Pacific coast. And if Cascadia ruptures first, the shifting stress might trigger the San Andreas shortly afterward. In the worst-case scenario, people in California could feel one enormous quake, watch buildings sway and highways break apart, and then see a second disaster just minutes later. And the opposite sequence could happen too. The San Andreas could snap first, redistribute pressure through the crust, and nudge Cascadia to failure. In this case, people living in the affected area might survive the first quake and then see the ocean suddenly pull away from the shoreline. And that's the chilling signal that a tsunami could arrive in about 20 minutes. Scientists know from analyzing the sediment that this sequence has happened before. There were at least 10 paired earthquakes over the past 3,100 years. The scariest part is that a new massive earthquake isn't about if, it's strictly about when. Now let's jump across the Atlantic to southern Italy. Just west of Naples, there's a massive volcanic system called the Campi Flegrei caldera. It means something like burning fields, and it earned that title honestly. About 109,000 years ago, a huge eruption blasted ash and rock across the region. It removed more than 36 cubic miles of magma from beneath the surface. It's a volume close to the massive eruption that formed the Campi Flegrei caldera around 40,000 years ago. That earlier eruption carved a crater about 9 miles wide and spread volcanic ash across huge parts of Europe. Today, more than 400,000 people live directly inside that ancient crater. The soil there feels incredibly fertile because crops have grown on broken-down volcanic ash for centuries. But the same geology that makes the land productive also hides enormous energy underground. Researchers recently studied ancient rock layers preserved in mountains and deep boreholes around the region. That's how they found out that Campi Flegrei may produce giant eruptions more often than scientists previously believed. That doesn't mean a catastrophic eruption will happen anytime soon, but it does change how researchers see the long-term danger. When these eruptions occur, they don't behave as ordinary lava flows. They generate pyroclastic flows, and those are fast-moving avalanches of hot gas, ash, and rock that race across the ground at highway speeds. Some ancient deposits from that eruption, more than 100,000 years ago, reach more than 6 feet thick in certain places, which proves just how violent the bang was. When you connect all these discoveries together, you once again see that our planet doesn't just sit quietly beneath our feet. It moves, breathes, and occasionally reminds us who really runs the place. And most of the time, the biggest forces shaping our world hide thousands of miles below where we stand.
The floor is lava! Haha, just kidding. But honestly, it's kind of falling apart. You might not feel it yet, but a huge part of North America has already lost 37 miles worth of rock from its foundation. And no, this isn't about earthquakes or giant sinkholes. It's about the continent losing pieces of the very thing that keeps the ground from wobbling around like a bad carnival ride. A team of researchers has just dropped a geological bombshell. Part of North America's ground is thinning out like a very sad, very slow ice cream drip. How do they know? They basically gave Earth a high-tech full-body MRI and created 3D maps showing how rocks once considered indestructible are now melting away into the planet's guts, like an upside-down cheese pizza inside an oven. But to really understand this mess, you first have to meet my old friends, cratons. Cratons are like the roots of the continents. They're thick, tough, and ancient. We're talking billions of years old. These bad boys survived meteor impacts, supervolcanoes, and even the tectonic movement of plates. If the plates got into fistfights, for example, you can bet we would see mountain ranges being born. If they got a divorce, drifting apart from each other, then a whole new ocean would be born. All of these things leave scars on the surface of Earth, but the cratons seem to always remain unfazed, like the cockroaches of geology. And since a craton can basically get punched in the face and feel nothing, scientists always assumed these things were nearly indestructible. But then, a group of researchers took their fancy machines to the test and realized that, wait, the cratons are falling apart? How? Enter the Farallon Plate, a really ancient tectonic plate that started to slide under North America's major plate over 100 million years ago. This is a pretty normal process, actually. It's called subduction, and it's how Earth recycles rocks and keeps itself from overheating. This subduction thing has been happening for so long that, by now, the Farallon is almost 400 miles away from the craton, sitting pretty chill at the lower mantle, weirdly close to the outer core of our planet. But the Farallon has been causing trouble, like that one roommate who moved out but keeps leaving weird stuff in the fridge. You see, as it sinks, it tugs on the bottom of North America's foundation, stretching it out and causing pieces to fall off into the deep mantle. And if that wasn't enough drama, the sinking Farallon has also leaked water and carbon dioxide into the surrounding rocks, making the craton even softer and easier to shred apart. Thanks, Farallon. Very cool of you. By studying hundreds of earthquakes across thousands of monitoring stations, scientists have confirmed the story. Big chunks of continental material are dripping downward, thinning the craton by as much as 37 miles. That's more missing rocks than can fit into a milk carton. Sounds dramatic, right? But don't worry. This is happening at a snail's pace. It'll take millions of years for anything noticeable to happen. Your great-great-great-great few grandkids from the distant future might still be standing on solid ground. But don't get too comfy. This thing may not be an urgent problem, but there's another type of sinking that's happening faster than you can say, "Help." Here's the thing. By 2050, at least 32 major cities in the US, including New York, Baltimore, and Charleston, could be partially underwater. And guess what? This one is mostly our fault. Scientists noticed that since 2007, some cities have been sinking into the ground between 0.04 and 0.08 inches every year. Charleston, in South Carolina, is pulling ahead in the worst way possible, sinking 0.15 inches annually. Sure, these numbers sound tiny and a bit ridiculous, but Charleston is barely 9 feet above sea level. And a little sinking goes a long way when the ocean is breathing down your neck. On really bad flood days, people there have to abandon their cars and basically swim home. This whole phenomenon is called land subsidence. And when you mix sinking land with rising sea levels, you get a disaster cocktail of flooded streets, salty farmland, ghost forests, and a lot of very cranky homeowners. And it doesn't stop with just homes. Infrastructure like bridges, roads, airports, and power plants, all things we rely on daily, are also at risk of serious damage. Flooded electrical grids and sunken highways could cause billions more in economic losses and create major safety hazards for communities. Now, let's be fair. Not everything is humanity's fault. Some of this trouble dates all the way back to the Ice Age. About 12,000 years ago, massive ice sheets covered the northern US. They were heavy, like seriously heavy. The weight pushed the land down, and when the ice melted, the ground didn't just pop back up like a trampoline. Instead, it started playing a weird game of geological seesaw. The places that were squished started rising, and the places that weren't got pulled down. This whole process, called glacial isostatic adjustment, try to say that 3 times fast. But of course, humans found a way to make it worse. Groundwater extraction is a major culprit. Think of it like pulling the stuff out of the mattress. After a while, the whole thing just sags. In places like California's Central Valley, the land is dropping by up to 8 inches a year because we keep pumping out water during droughts. In cities like New York, the problem isn't just water. Skyscrapers themselves are making it worse. Yep, turns out if you stack millions of tons of concrete and steel onto soft ground, it tends to flatten. And in case you're wondering, the total mass of New York City's buildings is around 1.68 trillion pounds. That's about the same as 3.5 million statues of liberty piled up. With so much weight concentrated over a relatively small area, the underlying soils have no choice but to compress over time. And if you thought it couldn't get messier, think again. We've been building dams, which stop rivers from delivering fresh sediment to coastal areas. That sediment is kind of like Mother Nature's way of fluffing the ground back up. Without it, coastal lands are compacting like an old sponge. Plus, when wetlands are drained for agriculture or construction, the peaty soil dries out and collapses. Honestly, it's like the ground just can't catch a break. Scientists also noticed that the areas that used to be lush wetlands are now among the fastest sinking spots in the country, especially along the Gulf Coast. Louisiana, for example, is losing about a football field of land because of this mix of subsidence and rising seas. So what's the end game here for us regular people who just want to live above sea level? Well, it's not looking great. Ghost forests, which are basically drowned woodlands, are popping up. Farmland is turning salty and unusable. And even sunny day flooding, where streets flood without any rain, is becoming a thing. Yikes! Meanwhile, over on the West Coast, California is not exactly winning either. San Francisco and Los Angeles are both sinking, which means that rising sea levels could hit them twice as hard and twice as fast. In some places like the Palos Verdes Peninsula, the ground has been sinking so fast, people over there might as well live like moles. So, is America turning into the next Atlantis? Probably not next week, but without serious action, like cutting back on groundwater pumping and planning smarter cities, at least 500,000 people are in serious danger. And the housing damage could easily rack up a jaw-dropping $109 billion by 2050. In the end, while North America isn't about to sink like a poorly made souffle, it's definitely showing some cracks in the crust. So maybe let's ease up on groundwater pumping, rethink how and where we build, and invest a little more in keeping our feet dry. After all, if the floor really does become lava someday, we're gonna wish we had at least fixed the leaks first. Utah is turning into a desert, and it's happening way faster than anyone thought. In just a few decades, the state's most famous lake could dry up completely. And when that happens, huge clouds of toxic dust could cover entire cities, forcing millions of people to leave their homes for good. So, what is really going on? Utah is a western state in the US, and locals like to joke that it's already pretty much one big desert. And honestly, they're not that wrong. Most of the state is scorching hot and dry. In fact, Utah won the title of the second driest state in the entire country. But that only feels like a win if you actually enjoy temperatures of 101 degrees Fahrenheit. But when I say desert, don't picture endless sand dunes like the Sahara. Utah's deserts are more about canyons, rocky landscapes, and very scarce vegetation. And if you look at the state from above, a huge body of water immediately stands out. That's the Great Salt Lake, the largest saltwater lake in the entire Western Hemisphere. But soon, it might not even be a lake at all. Yep, this whole region is turning into a desert, no exception. That's a big deal because the Great Salt Lake isn't just any lake, it's essential for them. And there are 3 big reasons why. First, there's the cultural side. Long before any major cities ever showed up, it was already a place of deep spiritual meaning for indigenous tribes in Utah. Then there's the wildlife. This region is a crucial stop along the migration routes of about 10 million birds, including eared grebes and American avocets. For them, it's a place to feed, nest, and rest before continuing their journey. And finally, there's the economy. The Great Salt Lake is worth big money, bringing in about $1.3 billion a year for Utah. But its reach goes far beyond the United States and supports industries all over the world. This place is packed with brine shrimp, also known as sea monkeys. These tiny crustaceans are very important since they feed fish farms in dozens of countries. Believe it or not, almost half of the world's brine shrimp supply comes from the Great Salt Lake. But it's not just about these little creatures. This region also gives us magnesium, sea salt, and other minerals that keep Utah's economy running. It's such an important spot that it provides jobs for about 9,000 people. Now that you know how essential the Great Salt Lake is, here's the hard truth. It's drying up, fast. And there are 2 big culprits: the weather and, well, us. You see, the lake's been feeding the effects of shifting weather patterns. For a while now, more of the region's precipitation has been falling as rain instead of snow. And that's bad news. Snow is better for the lake because it piles up in the mountains and melts slowly, feeding the lake over time. But now, with less snow and more rain, the lake isn't getting refilled like it used to. And then there's the human factor. Starting back in the early 1900s, authorities began building dams, canals, and pipelines around the lake. The idea was simple: divert the lake's water to farms, factories, and the fast-growing towns nearby. People along the Wasatch Front have been actively diverting water from the lake for over a century. But in the last few decades, things have really ramped up. Think about it. Back in 1982, the Salt Lake City area had around 700,000 people. Fast forward to 2025 and it's about 1.2 million. That's a lot more showers, crops, and industry all pulling water away from the lake. And that brings us to where things stand today. Parts of the Great Salt Lake are now only about 40% full by volume. Sure, the water levels rise and fall from year to year, but overall, they've been dropping for decades. Back in the 1980s, the Great Salt Lake stretched over more than 3,000 square miles. By 2021, it barely covered 950 square miles. At this rate, the lake could disappear completely within just a few years. Pretty terrifying, huh? And the danger isn't just about the cultural history that could disappear, the millions of birds that could be lost, or Utah's economy taking a massive hit. The air itself could become harmful, turning this whole region into a dangerous place to live. Turns out, the sediments at the bottom of the Great Salt Lake are packed with materials that show high reactivity. In simple terms, stuff that could be bad, even toxic for us. When the lake shrinks, the exposed lake bed dries out and turns to dust, and that dust doesn't just stay put. It gets picked up by the wind and blown straight into the air. The problem is that the lake is pretty close to big cities, and the dust that could come from it might carry metals like manganese, iron, copper, and lead, all of which can seriously irritate your lungs. When that happens, it can trigger inflammation and lead to respiratory issues. Experts believe it might also be connected to heart problems, developmental defects, and other serious health risks. These findings were published in 2024. At the time, scientists admitted they couldn't yet confirm whether those toxic substances were reaching populated areas. They still needed better equipment to track the wind and all. Even so, people were already worried. Then, in May of 2025, the headlines hit. A dust storm carrying toxic elements had, in fact, swept across the Salt Lake Valley, impacting residents in some of Utah's most densely populated areas. People in Magna and Tooele County actually watched a massive plume of dust roll right over their cities. So yeah, even though we still need more studies to know just how bad things could get, or if the biggest cities will be hit, groups like the nonprofit Grow the Flow say the disaster is already underway. They report that dust storms from more than 1,000 square miles of exposed lakebed are already drifting into nearby communities, affecting the air people are breathing right now. This is just one reason why the situation is becoming such a big crisis, and why the authorities are so concerned. But it's not like there's nothing that can be done. People in Utah are already taking steps to turn things around, or at least keeping it from getting any worse. Over the past few years, Utah's authorities have made getting water back to the Great Salt Lake a top priority. They've done it by creating special policies for farmers and setting up new tools to track water flows, for example. They believe those efforts are starting to pay off. The lake hit a historic low in 2022, but the winters of 2023 and 2024 brought above average snowfall. When that snow melted, the water ran into rivers and helped the lake rise a little. That's good news, but not great. I mean, the lake is still several feet below what's considered an ecologically healthy level. So, they had to come up with more ambitious plans. And recently, almost 23 billion gallons of water were sent from Utah Lake to the Great Salt Lake through the Jordan River. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 750 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's enough water to supply about 3,000 homes for a year. The good news is that most of Utah's lake water comes from snowpack melt. and not long ago, it was nearly 96% full. So this plan is a real win-win. It helps keep the Great Salt Lake at a healthier level, and it also helps prevent flooding at Utah Lake. This is probably just the start. Over the next few months, the Great Salt Lake could get another boost from more controlled water releases across its basin. Of course, this problem is far from over, but every drop of water helps. If these efforts keep going, Utah might actually have a fighting chance to save this precious lake and keep the area from possibly turning into a desert. Closing the North Sea in a nearly 400-mile-long dam may save Europe from complete disaster. This is not some sci-fi stuff. It's real, and it's called NEED, Northern European Enclosure Dam. It's a last-ditch plan to save over 25 million people from 15 European countries from the rising sea levels. To build this giant bathtub, humans need one dam between England and France, another one between Norway and Scotland, 51 billion tons of sand, and almost 600 billion euros. As crazy as it may sound, this project is totally feasible, except for one teeny tiny detail. The scientists who had this literally life-saving idea don't want the dam to be built. First and foremost, the NEED needs, two dams. One that is 100 miles long and almost 334 feet deep in the English Channel, and another that is 300 miles long and more than 1,000 feet deep in the North Sea. Building something like this requires a crazy amount of materials, like the 51 billion tons of sand we mentioned before, which is basically all the sand everyone on the planet uses in a year. And yes, this dam would obviously be the biggest in history, smashing records like the Netherlands' 19-mile Afsluitdijk and South Korea's 20-mile Semangam seawall. The NEED Dam would be 19 times bigger than Semangam. It sounds ridiculous, but it's not impossible. You see, humans are pretty good at building big stuff. Oil rigs, for example, operate at depths of up to 6,500 feet, and the NEED Dam would only go down more than 1,000 feet. Plus, China has a 102-mile-long bridge, and the dam would only be 4 times longer. Besides, projects like this dam were done before for the exact same reason. It's our friend Afsluitdijk in the Netherlands, which was built almost 100 years ago. The idea here was to shut off a part of the North Sea called Zuiderzee and protect the Netherlands from all the flooding because most of the country is below sea level. They even drained one of the lakes formed by the dam and created a whole new province, Flevoland. Today, the Netherlands has more than 2,200 miles of flood protection, but it's only designed for a 15-inch sea level rise. Without it, the country would be underwater. So yeah, we could do it, but it's really expensive. How expensive? Well, it would cost around 550 billion euros if the project is wrapped up in about 20 years. One wrong step and humans can spend 100 years building this dam, and a couple of billion euros more. The good news is that this much money can be diluted over the 20 to 100 years it takes for the dam to get finished. Besides, the 15 countries it would protect could share the expenses, reducing the amount to only 0.1% of the GDP of all the countries. Not a bad deal to save millions of people, right? Okay, but is this monstrosity really necessary? Well, unfortunately, humans have managed to turn the ocean against us. This means that by 2100, the sea levels are expected to have risen between 1 to 2 feet. If we keep acting like it's none of our business, the rise can reach more than 16 feet by 2300. It may sound like a distant future, but NASA has just discovered that the ocean rose way more than they expected in 2024, which means global disaster is breathing down our necks as we speak. Let's go back to our geography classes for a moment and learn why sea levels are rising altogether. First, because land can sink. The city of Norfolk, Virginia, for example, was built inside a massive crater, and the earth there can erode and sink. Then the soil can get compacted. Because of that, the city is literally sinking into the ground, making it more vulnerable to flooding. In California, some areas are sinking too, but this time it's because of the movement of tectonic plates. Some of the land that is underwater goes up, some of the land over the water goes down. The consequences? Again, heavy flooding. Sea levels also rise if the planet gets too hot. This happens because of a thing called thermal expansion. It has a very scientific name, but it basically means that things like water get bigger if the temperature rises. Half of the reason why sea levels are rising is because of this. This is why the level of the ocean increases almost 10 feet every time the average temperature of the planet rises by 33.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Since 1880, the sea has risen more than 8 inches. Okay, so we build the Need Dam and the problem is solved, right? Well, building this dam comes with massive consequences. First, the ocean currents, think of them as underwater highways that deliver nutrients to tiny creatures like planktons, not the SpongeBob villain, and give rides to animals like lizards and tortoises. A dam this big is capable of messing up the ocean currents that bathe Europe, disrupting the food chain not just inside the dam, but outside too. The currents are also responsible for the climate of coastal areas. The Gulf Stream, for example, is a warm current that comes all the way from Mexico and makes the weather in northwestern Europe a bit more bearable. If the Gulf Stream got interrupted by a gigantic oceanic barrier, it could make parts of Europe even colder. Another problem is that the North Sea would turn into a gigantic freshwater lake. This would happen because the salt water that used to flow from the ocean would now be blocked. And the North Sea would only be fed by the fresh water coming from inside the continent. This process would eventually lead to a thing called desalination, when salt water gets less salty. And it's really terrible because saltwater animals would start to absorb more water than they should, making the cells of their bodies swell. The consequences can be fatal. The disruption of the ocean currents by the dam can also affect the renewal of oxygen in the water. Think of the ocean as a giant recycling system. Surface water needs to sink to deliver oxygen to the deep sea, keeping creatures dwelling at the bottom alive. Without the movement of ocean currents, oxygen would run out and toxic bacteria would take over, creating a poisonous environment for sea creatures. And this is not just a theory. It happened before, 250 million years ago. The ocean got so toxic, it wiped out 95% of marine life and caused a mass extinction. If it's not bad enough, the fishing industry would collapse, and the busiest trading ports of Europe like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg would be stuck inside the dam. Sure, we could build sluice gates, but imagine all those traffic jams. The rain patterns of the countries protected by the dam would change too, affecting farming lands and food production. On the other hand, if we do nothing about rising sea levels, permanent flooding could make whole countries disappear. 3 million people on the islands of the Pacific would need to move away by the end of the century. The Maldives would lose 77% of its territories, and cities like Jakarta, Bangladesh, and Lagos would go underwater. Storms would get more dangerous too, destroying treatment plants for sewage and power stations and contaminating farmlands. Rising salt water could also contaminate freshwater supplies, and it's not just happening in Asia and Europe. Philadelphia, for example, is already developing plans to deal with this bleak scenario. This is why the scientists who developed this big red button shaped like a dam don't want people to actually build a dam. They know how bad things can get, which is why they came up with a plan so wild it's basically the engineering version of screaming, "Hey, stop ignoring the planet!" It's a warning. If we don't act now, we'll be stuck building megadams just to keep our cities from becoming Atlantis 2.0. And let's be honest, nobody wants to live in a future where the apocalypse looks like the deep web version of The Little Mermaid.
Is the Big Apple getting a little too heavy for its own good? A recent study revealed that New York City is sinking. And get this, it's all because of those towering skyscrapers. Apparently, the whole event is called subsidence, which is when the Earth's surface settles bit by bit, or suddenly sinks. Soft sediments shifting and the weight of the city itself are the culprits behind this sinking sensation. Now, don't get too alarmed. The study found that New York is sinking at a rate of 0.04 to 0.07 inches per year. Sure, that doesn't sound like much, but there are parts of the city that are sinking even faster than that. This sinking situation could cause some trouble for the city, especially since it's already pretty low-lying and home to over 8 million people. So it's important that local authorities come up with some strategies to tackle the growing flood risk and rising sea levels. Although, I'm not sure building giant seawalls is the way to go. We might need to get a little more creative than that. Geologists want to make sure we're all aware that building more high-rises near the coast, rivers, or lakes could contribute to future flood risks. So we really need to think twice before we start constructing skyscrapers left and right. In recent studies, scientists calculated the total mass of all the buildings in New York City, over 1 million of them, and it adds up to a whopping 1.68 trillion pounds. Talk about a heavy load. Now, they didn't include the weight of the roads, sidewalks, bridges, and other paved areas, so you can only imagine how much more weight is added to the city. But hey, even with these limitations, the researchers did a pretty good job of accounting for the complex geology beneath New York, including the sand, silt, clay deposits, and good old bedrock. They found out that certain types of soil, like clay and artificial fill, are more prone to subsidence. On the other hand, bedrock stays pretty firm and keeps those skyscrapers in place. So at least we don't have to worry about the Empire State Building taking a dive anytime soon. Comparing their fancy models with satellite data, the researchers created a map of the city showing where the sinking is happening. And guess what? The increased urbanization and all that groundwater pumping and draining are only making things worse. It's high time we start protecting our resources, don't you think? I wouldn't start packing my bags just yet. New York isn't the only sinking city out there, you know. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is facing some serious sinking action too. In fact, parts of it could be underwater by 2050. That's like a real-life Atlantis situation. Over 30 million people in Jakarta are now deciding if they should relocate the entire city. If there's a city out there we should worry about sinking, that's Venice for sure. But why is it so eager to take a dive, you might ask? Well, let me tell you the complex truth. You see, Venice decided to set up shop on a marshy lagoon with shoddy foundations. As time went by, the ground underneath just couldn't hold it together and started compacting like a squished marshmallow. On top of that, the city's been slurping up groundwater like it's going out of style or something. The cherry on top of this mushy cake is that the sea levels have also been slowly rising. And guess what? Those sneaky plate tectonics are having a laugh by shoving the Adriatic plate under the Apennine Mountains, giving Venice an extra push downward. Someone had the bright idea to stop pumping groundwater, thinking they could stop the sinking shenanigans. But hold your gondolas. A new study revealed that the sinking hasn't completely stopped, just slowed down a bit. It turns out the whole area is tilting ever so slightly to the east, with Venice perched on the slightly higher end. You must be wondering how much Venice sinks in a year, right? Brace yourself for this shocking revelation. It's sinking at a rate of about 0.04 to 0.07 inches a year, similar to New York. At this pace, in the next 20 years, it could sink a whopping 3 inches below sea level. To avoid turning into a Venetian fishbowl, locals are frantically building special barriers to keep the water from crashing into the lagoon. But don't hold your breath, because this project has had more delays than you'd expect. Oh, and have you noticed that charming old-style vibe in Venice? It's not just because they're fans of the vintage look. Those salty waters have been wreaking havoc on the buildings, thanks to the water levels constantly breaching the original damp proofing. Now the water's cozying up to the masonry, and the ground floors of many apartments are no longer safe enough to live in. Now, when will Venice take a dive into the abyss? It's hard to say for sure. Subsidence and rising sea levels are as slow and unpredictable as a turtle in a marathon. But experts have playfully warned that if things continue as they are, Venice could be doing the backstroke beneath the waves by 2100. Fear not, though. They're doing their best to protect this floating gem of history and culture from becoming a Hollywood disaster flick. So don't cancel that Venice day trip just yet. New Orleans has a peculiar watery situation going on too. You see, this lively place was initially built just a smidge above sea level, and now it's gradually sinking. Back in the day, when an area of the city called the French Quarter was just popping up, folks had to make do with what they had. They scored the best land they could find, but it was only about 10 feet above sea level. And let's not forget, the rest of the city is as flat as a pancake, with the areas around the French Quarter being just a hair lower. Now, even though they knew they were up against some soggy odds, the resourceful New Orleans residents did their best to elevate their houses above the flood-prone land they chose as their home. There's more. The ground beneath New Orleans is as wobbly as a plate of Jell-O. Architects had to keep things short and sweet because they feared the soil couldn't handle the weight of taller structures. They played it safe, sticking to 2 or 2.5 stories. Here's where it gets interesting. The city installed a fancy drainage system in the 1900s, thinking it would solve their water woes. And while it did help with the marshes and all, it inadvertently sucked the life out of the soil. Yep, the ground was left high and dry, without enough sediment and water to keep it steady. As a result, those former marshes sank as if they were in a quicksand competition. By the 1930s, things got even more topsy-turvy. 1/3 of the city was below sea level, and by the time Hurricane Katrina made its grand entrance, that number skyrocketed to around 50%. Oh, and here's the icing on the cake. Sea levels decided to join the party, rising faster than a helium balloon. So now, not only is New Orleans sinking, but the surrounding area is also at various degrees below sea level. So what can we do about all these sinking cities? Well, for instance, we could manage our water consumption a bit better. We can't just keep sucking groundwater out of the earth like there's no tomorrow. We've got to find new ways to quench our urban centers' thirst. Think about it. We could purify surface waters, or even turn salty seawater into a sweet solution. Of course, we'll need a boatload of energy to make it all work. Speaking of great urban water management, let me tell you about a town in Denmark called Nye. These guys have got it all figured out. They collect rainwater and use it to supply their toilets and washing machines. Talk about resourcefulness. Now that's what I call a splash of genius.
Australia feels like the safest place on Earth, geologically speaking. No megavolcanoes, no massive fault lines slicing cities in half, no constant earthquake alerts. It looks solid and unbreakable, but according to a brand new global stress map of Earth's crust, Australia is one of the most internally stressed pieces of land on the entire planet. It's not shaking or cracking yet, but it's quietly storing energy like a bent ruler about to snap. To understand why this is such a big deal, imagine Earth's crust like a giant jigsaw puzzle made of moving slabs called tectonic plates. These plates float on softer rock below and push, pull, or grind against each other. Where plates meet, earthquakes and volcanoes make sense. But stress doesn't just stay at the edges, it travels. It builds up inside plates too, like pressure spreading through frozen ice when you squeeze it. Scientists mapped over 100,000 real stress measurements from oil wells, rock tests, and earthquakes. to see where Earth is being squeezed the hardest right now. When they laid all the data together, the map lit up like a warning sign, and Australia stood out. This shocked scientists because Australia sits far away from plate boundaries, which usually means stability. But instead of relaxing, the Australian continent gets squeezed from multiple directions by nearby plates, especially the Pacific and Eurasian ones. The stress doesn't release easily, so it piles up inside the crust, and then nothing moves. Until suddenly everything does. One of the strangest discoveries showed up in places like the Bowen Basin, where stress directions twist and rotate underground. That's bad news because unpredictable stress behaves like glass about to shatter. These rotating stress fields make it nearly impossible to say when or where cracks could form. It could be years away or tomorrow. And human activity makes it even riskier. Drilling deep into the crust for geothermal energy or injecting fluids underground can nudge these stressed zones just enough to trigger fault movement. This doesn't mean Australia is about to split in half next week, but it does mean the idea of geologically safe might be outdated. Scientists now think Australia could eventually fracture internally and form new fault systems where none existed before. What makes the new stress map different from older models is that it doesn't just explain past earthquakes, it helps identify future risk zones before anything breaks. Countries can use this data to decide where drilling is safer, where tunnels shouldn't go, and where infrastructure needs reinforcement. But even with all this data, we still can't predict the exact moment Earth will snap. Stress maps tell us where the tension is. They don't tell us when it gives up. But this idea of continents quietly tearing themselves apart isn't just theory. Africa gives us the clearest real-world example. It's slowly unzipping itself. So slowly that no human will ever wake up and see a new ocean where land used to be, but fast enough that scientists can actually measure it happening right now. Deep beneath East Africa, the ground stretches, thins, and pulls apart as if the continent is taking a deep breath and never fully exhaling. And over millions of years, that stretch could turn into an ocean. This whole process centers on something called the East African Rift System, or EARS for short. Think of it like a giant tear running through the continent, thousands of miles long, cutting through countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. It's one of the biggest rift zones on Earth. A rift zone is exactly what it sounds like, a place where the planet's crust is being pulled apart instead of squeezed together. And Africa just happens to have one of the most dramatic examples anywhere on the planet. What's really happening is that Africa isn't one solid plate anymore. It's splitting into two massive chunks, the Nubian plate to the west and the Somalian plate to the east. These two plates are drifting away from each other at a speed that sounds laughable, just less than an inch per year. That's about the speed your fingernails grow. But give that process millions of years and suddenly continents don't look so permanent anymore. In 2018, photos of a giant split in Kenya went viral across the internet. Headlines screamed that Africa was splitting in half right now. It looked dramatic, but that moment didn't mean Africa suddenly broke overnight. That rupture was more like a surface ripple, a small local sign of a much bigger process that's been going on for around 25 million years. And if we could travel in time to 5 or 10 million years from now, we would probably see the crust thin enough for seawater to rush in. When or if that happens, East Africa would slowly peel away from the rest of the continent, and a brand new ocean basin would form between the two plates. Africa would lose its eastern shoulder, and maps of the world would need a serious update. As strange as that sounds, it's actually totally normal for Earth. The planet never stops reshaping itself. It just works on a timeline so slow that our brains struggle to process it. The continents we know today feel ancient and permanent, but they're basically temporary arrangements. About 138 million years ago, South America and Africa were locked together like puzzle pieces. You can still see it if you look at their coastlines. They match almost perfectly. East Africa drifting away will just be the next chapter in that story. Australia's story could follow a different path, but the physics are similar. Stress builds, rock resists. Then the rock fails. And stress doesn't care about borders, cities, or how calm the surface looks. That's why scientists are so concerned about something called SH-max, the direction of maximum horizontal stress. In simple terms, it tells us which way the Earth is squeezing the hardest underground. If that squeezing lines up with existing fractures, earthquakes become more likely. If it cuts across old faults, new ones can form. Turkey is another place where the stress map practically screams danger. The country sits where Arabian, Eurasian, and African tectonic plates collide. There's also a smaller Anatolian plate on which Turkey is located, and which gets squeezed westward like toothpaste, grinding against massive faults. The stress map shows SH-max pointing in directions that load these faults perfectly. Now, researchers looked at ancient lava flows near one of Turkey's faults and realized they weren't random. Lava sheets once flowed smoothly across the land, cooled into solid rock, and then got pulled apart over time, like a snapped chocolate bar. That gave scientists a rare, clear snapshot of how continents deform from the inside out. To date the lava, the team used microscopic zircon crystals trapped inside it. These crystals work like natural stopwatches. They trap helium created by radioactive decay, and by measuring that helium, scientists can tell when the lava erupted and cooled. When they combine that with satellite images and remote sensing, the scientists managed to see Earth's slow-motion movements. The Tuzgolu Fault stretches more than 120 miles and is so massive that you can spot it from space. For years, scientists assumed it behaved like many of Turkey's dangerous faults, where land slides sideways past itself. But this new research flipped that idea on its head. The fault isn't sliding, it's slowly ripping open. The land on either side moves away from each other at less than an inch per year. That sounds tiny, but then again, over thousands or millions of years, that motion adds up to continents literally thinning and breaking. And since the fault sits where three massive tectonic plates meet, this matters way beyond Turkey. All this once again reminds us that continents don't just collide or slide. Sometimes they stretch until they snap. And places that look calm on the surface might already be under invisible strain, inch by inch, year after year, rewriting the map long before anyone feels the shake.
So a few years ago, in 2019, folks in Australia said they liked an old idea with a new twist, using extra floodwater from the north to help dry areas in the west and south. This plan got the name of the new Brandfield scheme. It was based on an old idea from the 1930s. The idea was to catch floodwater from the north and move it to the south and west. But the original plan never actually happened. Over the years, lots of experts said it wouldn't work. They thought it was too expensive and too tricky to build, even though it could potentially help fix drought problems in dry parts of Queensland. The original idea appeared a long time ago, when an engineer named John Brandfield got a big idea. He wanted to take floodwater from rivers in northern Queensland and send it inland to Lake Erie, one of the driest spots in Australia. He planned to use dams, pumps, really big pipes, and even tunnels to transport all that water over the Great Dividing Range, a big mountain range in Australia. The biggest dam would have been called Hell's Gate, and Brandfield wanted it twice as tall as what it was originally planned. This way, pumps and gravity could help move the water over the Great Dividing Range. The water would then flow south and help irrigate farmland near places like Hughenden. It would change the weather, make it rain more, and turn the dry land into green farms. Eventually, it would reach Lake Erie, turning the desert into a green growing area. That way, Australia could grow more food, sell it to other countries, and make more jobs. He hoped that the area could turn into a food bowl for the country. For some time, people talked about the plan a lot. They loved the idea. They thought it could change how farming worked. And some even believed that nature had already planned for the land to be filled with water. Dry rivers and lake beds were just waiting to be used. They even said that rains fell on the wrong side of the mountains, and Brandfield's plan could fix that. But when the authorities looked into this idea, they found big problems. And the main one was that the plan would cost too much. Plus, there weren't enough scientists or engineers to do a full investigation. The land was too dry and harsh. No one was sure it would even work, like how much water would really get there. Plus, some of Brandfield's measurements were wrong, especially the dam heights. So, in 1947, they officially shut the project down, claiming that even if they built the project, it wouldn't be worth it. After all, even places next to oceans, like parts of Chile, still stay bone dry, so a big lake might not result in more rain. And still, in 2019, one political party brought the idea back with an updated version called the new Brandfield scheme. They wanted to try it again, but with some changes to make it work better. Their plan included the following steps. Take water from the South Johnstone, Tully, Herbert, and Burdekin rivers. Store that water using a big dam called Hell's Gate Dam, but this time they wanted to make the dam twice as tall as in the original plan. Let the water flow through tunnels using gravity instead of using lots of pumps. Move the water under the mountains and into the Warrego River in southern Queensland. Use the water to grow crops in dry places south and west of Hughenden, a huge area even bigger than Tasmania, eventually turning it into a food bowl. At the same time, they didn't say how much the whole project would cost, but they promised to spend $20 million to let Australia's National Science Agency check if the plan could work. Those innovative ideas sounded good, but for over 80 years, loads of experts kept saying, "Nope, it won't work." Why? Brandfield said his idea would cost £40 million back in 1941. That's about $3.2 billion today. But the new version of the plan might cost more than $15 billion and take over 10 years to build. Also, people who care about nature are worried. They explain that taking water away from where it usually goes could hurt animals and plants. It might let invasive plants and animals spread to new places. It might mess up rivers and oceans, where fish and other animals live. It could even hurt towns and businesses near the coast that depend on those natural water flows. Still, some people really believed in the idea and thought it was worth doing, especially to help farmers and fix drought problems. However, in 2022, the government decided to stop trying to fix the drought in western Queensland with the Brandfield scheme. Experts looked closely at the plan and said it just wouldn't work. The problem? There's not enough water all the time to make it happen. Apparently, the new cost of the plan would have been over $30 billion. That's a huge amount of money. You could buy yourself a fleet of private jets and luxurious yachts, and more. So experts said you'd need lots and lots of water to spend that kind of money, but the water just isn't there. Now, instead of one huge project, they suggested doing smaller water projects closer to where the rain and waterfalls are. These smaller projects, called mini Brandfield grids, would be in 4 places along the Queensland coast. Those little grids could share water when some places had more or less rain. Other scientists looked at the plan too, and they agreed. Even if things went super well, the Brandfield scheme would still cause problems and cost way too much, while the mini water grids project looks more plausible. They think the dry parts west of the mountains will do better without the full-scale Brandfield scheme. There are easier and cheaper ways to help those places grow and get water. So the big plan was dropped, and now they're looking at smarter, smaller ideas to help with water and farming. And the matter is quite urgent. Australia is a super dry place, one of the driest places people actually live in. When there's a drought, there's not much water around. That means farms don't grow as much food, and that can cause a lot of problems. In the future, droughts are likely to happen more often and be worse. That's why it's necessary to start getting ready now. Experts are working on something called the Drought Resilience Mission, trying to figure out how to deal with droughts better in the future. One of them looked at how much droughts actually cost Australia. His research shows that droughts can hurt a lot of things – farms, jobs, towns, and even the whole country. When there's no rain for a really long time, some towns can actually run out of water. That's called day zero. It's when the taps in people's houses get turned off because there's just no water left. In 2020, a town in Queensland called Stanthorpe hit day zero. About 50 other towns were really close, too. When such a situation happens, the only way to get water is by bringing it in with trucks, and that's super expensive. Stanthorpe had to get around 20 trucks of water every day for a year and a half. It cost them about $800,000 every month. In the end, they spent over $14 million just to have water. Luckily, it started raining again and filled the dams back up. But the authorities are working on ways to stop this kind of thing from happening again. They want to help towns be ready so they never run out of water like that. Because drought just doesn't mess with water, it can also mess with people's health. When everything dries up, plants vanish and the soil gets loose. Then the wind picks it up and makes huge dust storms. Those dust clouds can blow really far, even into such big cities as Sydney. That's what happened in 2018. The air got so bad that kids, older people, and anyone with breathing problems had to be extremely careful. The dust ruined some crops and made different foods, even fruit, unsafe to eat.